Thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I must thank Kevin for his kindness in asking me, and also thank him for the essay he sent round to us to read as a basic fodder for our seminar. Can you hear me? I might sort of hear. Okay. So everything Kevin writes is good, and so was that essay. Thanks, Kevin, very much. I'm a great admirer of you, as I am of so many of you in this room, and I'll mention in particular Con Bazikos, whose foundation of the Australian Society for Classical Education, have I got it right here, has impressed me so much, and I've been involved with that from the beginning. But it's a pleasure to be here. I've met so many people I've known before, and I'm also meeting for the first time in the flesh people that I've corresponded with, and it's been just wonderful. So a trigger warning first. Any of you who may, some of you may possibly be offended if your grasp of the third declension is not quite what it ought to be, but we'll forgive that, and I hope you'll take it in good part. I wondered why Kevin put me in the first slot, and I suppose it was because, as the oldest person here, he felt that I would actually have met some of the great figures from late antiquity. Sadly, I can't promise that. You're all familiar with lines from Keats, which are quoted so many times. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. I beg your pardon. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Those of us who fear for the future of civilization, not just Christian civilization, but any civilization worthy of the name, find resonance in this poem. The tidy little phrase, "the centre cannot hold," conveys a powerful image of all the components of our culture shearing off from their centre and speeding into outer space with centrifugal force. The centre cannot hold. And terrifying too is the thought in the poem of that hideous creature slouching towards its birth, a cuckoo in the nest, like Rosemary's Baby, coming right into the centre of Jerusalem. So my task in this paper is to justify and defend, I see my task is to justify and defend the discipline of classics, one of those ancient bulwarks against cultural entropy, to trace its development thus far and to consider whether it has a future, and if so, of what kind that future might be. Classics is perhaps one of the less reputable ancient bulwarks against cultural entropy. Try as you might, you cannot construct a big collection of women writers, for example, from Greece and Rome. I mean, there were some, we know that, but it's a hopeless task, and that makes us unpopular in the eyes of many who see this classics very much as a men's activity. And of course, in my grandparents' day, boys were taught Latin and sometimes Greek in Australia, but girls did things like Italian and drawing. It was not seen as a woman's domain, although of course there were many women who were great writers in Latin and Greek, and also great scholars in those subjects. Anyway, that's the past, and the world has moved on, and I'm pleased to say it has. I had myself what passed for a classical education in the second half of the 20th century. I was being part of the process of phasing it out, I guess. By the time I arrived on the scene, the great days of the classics had already faded. No longer might a British general announce his victory in a telegram with a single Latin pun in the certainty that it would be understood. I'm referring to General Napier, who in 1843, after capturing the province of Sind, Sindh, is said to have sent a telegram which simply said, "Peccavi, I have sinned." The story is possibly apocryphal, but the main point is that it was in Punch and that people generally understood it. and again the time has passed when a churchman like Prebendary Gaisford could boast, and I'm reading the quote in full. Hello. The advantages of a classical education are twofold. It enables us to look down with contempt on those who have not shared its advantages, and it also fits us for places of emolument, not only in this world but in the next. And that story is probably apocryphal too, it has to be said, or if genuine, was certainly intended ironically, but generations of classic students delighted in it. By the 60s and 70s, the view still survived in the British civil service, and up to a point even in Australia, that classics was the best basis for almost anything. You perhaps remember Yes Minister. I think most people would remember Yes Minister. Bernard saying, if you had looked a Trojan horse in the mouth, Minister, you'd have found Greeks inside. Well, the point is it was the Greeks who gave the Trojan horse to the Trojans, so technically it wasn't a Trojan horse at all, it was a Greek horse. Hence the tag Timeo Danaus et Dona Ferentes, which you'll recall is usually and somewhat inaccurately translated as beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Or doubtless you would have recalled had you not attended the LSE. And James Haggard just says, Greek tags are all very well, but can we stick to the point? At the University of Oxford, classics have famously been called greats for generations. There's no compromise there, is there? You're doing greats or something else. At the University of Glasgow, the Department of Humanity was for many years until 1957 the formal name of the Latin department. What proud self-assurance is there. And today, even in the US, can be found the belief that liberal arts, with its strong underpinning of classical studies, is the best basis for specialization in other fields. In the early 70s, one of my professors, as an undergraduate, still clung to the opinion that English literature ought not to be taught at a school or university level. We read English, he would say, but we study classics. T.S. Eliot appears to be of the same opinion when he says, and this is quoting from his essay, Modern Education and the Classics, his 1932 essay, one of the potential causes of deterioration of the universities is the deterioration lower down. The universities have to teach what they can to the material they can get. Nowadays, they even teach English in England. It's the same mentality in 1932, still lingering on. As undergraduates, we would snootily compare our classics with Penguin classics, and the Loeb editions of classical texts were sometimes scoffed at as the low ebb editions. But the writing was on the wall in our little ivory tower, and we were far too few to count for much. Yet for all that silly arrogance, now past, now discarded, now discounted, I personally remain deeply and unrelentingly grateful to have had the opportunities that I happily stumbled upon. And I greatly deplore the powerful trend in my own days to dismiss the classics as irrelevant and the Latin language as a tedious, soul-destroying waste of time. That attitude is an overreaction in favour of the new scientific disciplines of maths, chemistry and physics, which are all valuable and necessary, as well as sociology, for example, and some of the social sciences, and the unaccountably popular criminology, which are perhaps less necessary, at least at undergraduate level. The strength of the classics as a discipline lay in its breadth of vision, and I can't. It embraced the mental discipline of learning other languages, together with the psychosocial discipline of trying to get inside the heads of other cultures that shared our humanity, yet were so utterly alien in their thinking. It's one of the excitements of history generally, I think, trying to get inside the heads of other people. The classical world had long passed away. Oh, that lady's looking for a way in her shoes.
I think that door's working.
Oh, is it? Right, okay.
Andy, is that door working?
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy.
Sorry, yes. The classical world had long passed away, but its internal complexities were a world in microcosm. closed laboratory, small enough to be studied in depth, whose subsequent effects upon our own culture were not only discernible, but hugely inescapable. They shaped our world in ways so various and in depth so profound that modern men, especially those who have little awareness of history, struggle to understand or are indifferent to the steps that human beings have taken to get where we are now. We are indeed dwarves on the shoulders of giants. Quasi nanos gigantium humoris incidentes, a remark ascribed by John of Salisbury to Bernard of Chartres. I've often taken up arms against premature specialization, speaking personally. Whenever a young person tells me that he's going to university to do criminology or gender studies, I wonder to myself why they don't learn to read and write first. Now, that's a hard saying and a cruel one. That will cause offence, but I'll keep going. Criminology, by the way, strikes me as particularly odd. I spent a few months at the University of New England 5 years ago, and every second undergraduate I met was doing criminology. And was this because they were opposed to crime and wished to suppress it, or did they perhaps have ambitions to succeed in the area of crime? I don't know, but it seems an extraordinary subject to study when you've done no history, for example, virtually no history, and you can't read and write very well. But that sounds so snobby, and of course I guess it is, but putting the cart before the horse is a great tragedy in my view. It's a serious concern to me because we all know that possession of a university degree is no guarantee of literacy. I correspond from time to time with a young Chinese woman who graduated recently in journalism from the University of Tasmania. I use the term correspond loosely because she actually can't write English, and I doubt very much whether she can understand it because of the strange things she says in reply to my brief responses. And that's an appalling situation, a dire situation for the universities to be in, and yet few people in the universities will own up to the reality of the fact that standards have been lowered appallingly because of their business aspirations, as it were. By now you're probably thinking that I propose a return to the classics in the form that I sought to describe hitherto as the best solution to this sort of problem, but that's not the case. We will never recover the glory days, nor should we try. Never again will we expect large cohorts of boys and girls in school to spend many hours every week striving to write good prose and verse in Latin and Greek. So we're not going back. I'm not proposing that from that. I'm showing you my woke credentials here. The classics as we once knew them are gone forever. That intense and large-scale study of the classics. To say that the sum of human knowledge has mushroomed over the past century is a mere trivializing understatement. It's grown exponentially at a far greater rate than our capacity to master it. Even among the most specialized, there is a hierarchy of expertise. We have to accept that as a society we are drawn on, compelled by circumstances, to specialize more and more as human learning becomes more profound, arcane, and abstruse. All that means that we are bound to accept the realities of modern life and can no longer leave the sciences and other arts to play second fiddle to the original classics, even if we wanted to. We do have to strike a balance and ensure that the classics survive. T.S. Eliot, again, sees that as more than a desideratum, but an existential necessity. And he writes from the same essay, "It is quite possible, of course, that the future may bring neither a Christian nor a materialistic civilization. It is quite possible that the future may bring nothing but chaos or torpor. It is only upon readers who wish to see a Christian civilization survive and develop that I am urging the importance of the study of Greek and Latin." There was a time when most of the top students in an academically oriented school would take Latin right through to matriculation. Today, few schools even teach Latin, and in those that do, few enroll in it. Yet taking a worldview, I'd guess that the total numbers of those studying Latin and Greek at a high level are as great as they ever were. So the classics have lost out proportionately, but not necessarily numerically. We shall always need experts and specialists in the classics, as in every other field. So I draw to my conclusion with a sort of a confession. I am not as well read as many of my friends. Those of us who have a passion for languages but lack of flair take much longer to read a book in the original than in the vernacular. I've had the honour and the pleasure of reading Virgil and Horace, Homer and Euripides in the original, but I've never read Joyce's Ulysses, or War and Peace, or most of Shakespeare, and almost all of Keats and Shelley. And probably, let's be realistic, I never will. Some of us must do the linguistic hack work, while others can soar to Parnassus on the wings of the great English poets and prose writers. Such people need translations because nobody can do it all. To this extent only will I resile a little from my easygoing position. If a second language is to be studied at all, and that's always a good thing, it's difficult to imagine any language of more value to an English speaker than Latin. Not just because it's the chief source of our own lexicon in English, but because of its place in literature, history, theology, and even science. It's also the best place to start learning several other modern European languages. So I unreservedly apologise for speaking disdainfully of the Loeb Library as the low ebb of the great tradition. In fact, the Loeb Library has been a splendid aid to Western culture. I'm not sure whether everybody's familiar with it, but it's a whole library of books publishing the original Greek or Latin on one side and a facing translation, sometimes with good notes. And it's been such a valuable thing because it enables people who have not been able to devote much time to learning languages to penetrate them nevertheless and understand them, as it were, from the inside. I think that's such an important thing, to understand a language from the inside, guided but not hoodwinked by wise and clever translations. Yes, even the best translation is a secondary source, but good translations and commentaries are tools that help us to penetrate the mind of the author. Education, in my view, ought, before anything else, to lay the strongest possible foundation in reading and writing, maths, history, and clear thinking, as well as music and the other arts. These humane studies are in essence the subjects of the trivium and the quadrivium, of which we hear so much. And that's really what we mean by the classics. The linguistic skills that have been required have been relegated, that were once required, have been relegated to a position to the status of specializations, I think. Everybody can now access the classics and admire them and benefit by them through the aid of good translations, and especially when they're in a position to compare translations and when they have some basic knowledge of the language from which they're derived. But our students are being deprived by various kinds of identity-based studies, and you know what I'm talking about, that increasingly take up valuable class time. Only after basic and formative humane studies have been completed and the tools of literacy and clear thinking installed in our heads, then and only then is specialization not only allowable, but essential in a highly sophisticated world suffering from information overload. Here is Eliot again, finally. As the world at large becomes more completely secularized, the need becomes urgent that professedly Christian people should have a Christian education, which should be an education both for this world and for the life of prayer in this world. Classical studies must survive if Christian civilization is to survive. But they, at least in their linguistic aspect, will never again occupy that position of peculiar prominence once accorded to them by earlier generations. The classicists of the future will be specialists, a small minority of scholars providing essential ammunition to the body of the faithful. And finally, just to close with a remark by Pope John the 23rd, a remark whose content has been sadly neglected by the Catholic Church in the last few decades. The Holy Church has cultivated and kept in highest honour the source texts of this wisdom, and especially the Greek and Latin languages, as if they were a sort of golden robe clothing wisdom itself. Thank you, Ken. Thank you for that. Thank you all.
So thank you very much, David. And we've got plenty of time if people have any questions. But before I do, a couple of people arrived who haven't kind of introduced themselves yet. So is that Karina up the back?
Yes, please.
Oh, Karina, nice to meet you at last.
Yes. Did you want to say anything more than hello?
Absolutely. Why are you famous?
Well, I'm not famous yet, but I'm working on it. So I'm Karina Hebner, for those of whom I've not met yet. I've just literally flown in from Queensland. I've not been to Melbourne in 30 years. And so, I was kind of wandering aimlessly through different places, trying desperately to find an Uber. But I'm so thrilled to be here. People of whom I already know, and Dr. Daintree, I'm very, very glad to see you. We have responded by email.
I know, it's lovely to meet you at last.
And now I
Yeah.
get to see you face to face. So I'll be speaking to you all later, and again, I'll look forward to meeting everyone personally as well.
And where are you teaching at the moment?
Okay, so currently I teach in a regional city in Queensland, of whom there's several people in the room from the same area, Toowoomba, Queensland, and I'm a public school teacher currently. So I teach at a very large public school. So I'll be, when I present Maine, I'll be probably presenting a very interesting perspective and flavour to education and what can be done within the confines of public education.
Thanks very much. Did you want to just say briefly where you're from?
Yeah, Pat Byrne, I'm from the National City Council. Our magazine, News Weekly, is very keenly interested in supporting whatever we can in terms of the promotion of classical education. And I can say Dr. Daintree, a good friend of mine, graduated in classics at Queensland Uni about a decade ago, and you'd be pleased to know they awarded him the highest award, I can't remember what it's called at Queensland Uni, which hadn't been awarded for something like a decade. So there are still some good ones.
No, thank you for that. So any questions of David?
Oh, Peter came in too, I think, Kevin.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
Peter.
Yes. Hello, Peter.
He did introduce himself quickly.
Oh, did you? I'm sorry, I missed that. Yeah.
We'll catch up.
Yes, indeed we will. Yes, yeah.
So, any questions? A lot there to think about. Just very quickly, David, I mean, we've got classroom teachers here and principals or people who were principals in charge of schools. If I was trying to convince parents as to why their children should come to my school, which is committed to what I call a liberal education or a classical education within that tradition, what would you say to the parent? What are some good reasons why they should choose such a school?
Well, I think that, that's such a huge question, isn't it? And of course we all deal with it every day. It comes back to this business of kids not being given basics, not being taught basics, doesn't it? I talked about somebody doing criminology, and I rather cattily said that wouldn't it be better if they learned to read and write first? But people are not learning to read and write now, I think, and even, there are always those who struggled with reading and writing, and we've all taught them, those of us who've been teachers. But even people who are quite advanced in their studies and quite intelligent, medical students and law students, are often surprisingly, well, illiterate is probably too strong, but very, very little capacity for communicating in English. Very little capacity, and combined with a profound ignorance of history. And I think that's the most depressing thing of the lot. It's ignorance of history is the worriest thing. Because anybody can say anything nowadays. We can make any kind of assertion about our indigenous people we like, or we can make any assertion we like about people who transition their gender. But it'll be accepted because nobody has any basis for making judgments about factual things. So I would, so in answer to your question, I'd say find a school that will teach your young people to read and write and think and
Good
communicate
start.
and all those things that were really in the trivium, really, weren't they? The trivium and the quadrivium, those basic skills. We used to talk about the 3 R's, didn't we? And they're not being taught as much as they should be, because we've all got the same brain capacity as we had, as our forefathers had 2,000 years ago, but we've got much more material to deal with, and so much of that is moving into the classroom and excluding the possibility of studying things more valuable and more basic. Thanks, Kevin.
Tim.
Yeah, thanks. You made the comment that liberal arts, I presume you're talking about undergraduate type degrees, was the best basis for specialisation in other fields.
Yes.
Seems to me that Americans, by contrast to Australians, naturally get that. Part of their culture. I mean, if you look at the positives about America, it seems to be a very it's a liberal-minded culture. They are very lateral in the way they think. They're very creative. They're magnanimous, and thank God for America. Australians, I mean, I love Australia. I'm veering towards another big question, but more about where we are in Australia. It's a harder sell in Australia because we grew wealthy on the back of the sheep, and and now on the back of minerals and commodities, and really without those things we wouldn't enjoy the benefits of this largesse around us that we do. So I think we are in need of a big conversation about where we are right now as Australians and where we're going throughout this century as the inexorable shift, the geopolitical global economic shift towards this part of the world continues to occur. So, big question. Like, how do you link the liberal arts to that sort of big sort of question about where we are as Australians, why it's important for young kids to go on to aspire to do these liberal arts degrees so they can think big about Australia, where we are, what our role is, and then obviously flow on to leadership in more
Yeah, yeah. Well, Paul Morrissey could talk about this with more knowledge and freshness than I could, but I remember at Campion the frustration of talking to kids and parents and trying to justify taking a liberal arts degree before specialising in something else, and it's a hard battle, particularly when you find that most students just want to go with their mates to the local uni and do what their mates are doing, and we have no tradition in our country of not really a tradition of going away to study. You just commute from home, don't you? Whereas American kids are very used to the idea of going across the country to the college of their first choice. So it's a tough battle here. I could only think, I was only ever able to think of examples of evidence of people who had swum against the current. And I remember I've often quoted this story. Barry Jones, when he was a science minister, when he was Minister for Science, I think, was it the Whitlam government, went to IBM in America and asked what sort of graduates they were looking for. And he was told that what they really wanted but could never get enough at was people who were good at English and chess, and English and philosophy, and could play chess. So they wanted people who were versatile enough to had trained minds, again, come back to thinking and communicating, and they could learn computer languages much more easily than those who had untrained minds and no background. So you rattle off these examples to people in the hope that it'll make a difference, but it usually doesn't. It's a very hard battle. In fact, to tell a story against myself, I remember being invited to Riverview College in Sydney to talk about Campion and about the value of the classics and of the liberal arts, and they gave me a really good opportunity. I had the 40 years 11 and 12 together for 40 minutes and spoke at a great length and with great enthusiasm. And the next year we got a student from Riverview, And he turned up, and I interviewed him, as I always did when students first arrived, and I said, "Oh, you must have been at my talk at your school." He said, "No, I was sick that day." so it achieved absolutely nothing. So I'm sorry, Tim, it's a sort of pessimistic story to tell you, but there are those who have done well. We had a student at Campion who went into medicine in Notre Dame and became a very fine doctor, and a brave one too, because she represented the pro-life movement in her faculty, and she found she was one of the few who did. And from very little scientific background, she managed beautifully to do medicine. She was a clever girl, but the training in thinking and communicating was clearly very helpful in that. Thanks.
Right. That's a good time
Okay.
to
Right.
move on, but thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, everybody.